All right, so now that we know the basics of statistics and the different sampling methods, now let's talk about something that's really important to understand, which is statistical bias. And you're going to see this a lot in the real world. You can make statistics kind of look however you want to make it look. It doesn't mean that it's actually true. So let's talk about sampling bias first. So sampling bias is when the sample is not representative of the entire population. So I always think about that. So one way is the voluntary response bias, is sampling bias that often occurs when the sample is made up of volunteers. So if you think about like the online reviews of products and businesses, or even Rate My Professor, right? Those are rating people. People tend to only voluntarily leave reviews if they're either really unhappy or they're extremely happy. Most of the time, though, it's when they're really unhappy. So if you look at those ratings, a lot of the time they're not really representative of the entire population, because the only people that are taking the time to write a review are the people that are really angry or just extremely happy, so happy that they're willing to take that extra time out. Anyone that's just like, this works, this is fine, they're not going to take for the most part, they don't take the time out of their schedule to leave a review. A self-interest study is a bias that can occur when the researchers have an interest in the outcome. So, for example, let's say that the Meat Council releases a study stating that the consuming red meat poses little cardiovascular risk. Well, of course, if the Meat Council is the one doing the study, they're going to want to ensure that people will want to buy meat. And so there could be some self-interest in there with looking at the data or the results. And so again, you would want to look for, when you're looking at these statistics that come out, you want to look that it's coming from an organization that has no self-interest in this. So response bias. Response bias is when the responder gives an inaccurate responses for any reasons. So for example, let's say that there's a perceived lack of anonymity, and that's when the researcher responds fears giving an honest answer that might negatively affect them. So for example, maybe people would be scared to give a really bad report on their boss because they're scared of having negative repercussions. So they won't be as honest as they would have been. Loaded questions is another way for a response bias, and that's when the question wording influences the response. So for example, should the mall prohibit loud and annoying rock music in clothing stores catering to teenagers? So instead of saying something like rock music, they're using the word annoying in there. So that is a question that's a loaded question. Non-response bias can happen when people refuse to participate in a study or drop out of an experiment because we can no longer be certain that our sample is representative of the population. So this is really important to also make sure that when that happens, you end up having a sample that's really not representative of the population anymore, and so the data that you get from it is probably not that accurate. So let's look at some examples. Identify the most relevant source of bias in each situation. To determine opinions on voter support for a downtown renovation project, a surveyor randomly questions people working in downtown businesses. So this ends up being a self-interest bias, because obviously people that work downtown are going to be for a downtown renovation project. It's going to bring more people into their businesses. However, that doesn't actually give a good sample of all of the voters that would be voting on this. So you wouldn't want to just do people working in downtown businesses, but people that live in the area. A poll was conducted by phone with the question, do you often have time to relax and read a book? 50% of the people who were called refused to participate. So this is an example of a non-response bias. An employer puts out a survey asking their employees if they have a drug abuse problem and need treatment for help. This would for sure be a response bias because so many people are going to be, if they do have a drug abuse problem, they're not going to want to tell their employer that they have a drug abuse problem because they're going to be scared of any repercussions. So this ends up being a response bias.